Hello everyone, today we talk about the Rugi for our Migration Era Peoples series that I haven't updated for a long time. This began actually in the early days of Schwerpunkt for the major Germanic peoples mostly, and then it evolved and included the Slavs. We'll look at some Turkic steppe people mostly in the future, also because some of these peoples are running out ethnically wise in the list. In fact, the Rugi, the Airuli, etc., like these are a bit minor Germanic populations, but I think they're very important to cover because not just they fill sort of the overall gaps in this big puzzle, but in fact the latter wouldn't historically make sense without them, right? So briefly, because there are unfortunately also just so few things overall about these people's history at the point, but they're always fascinating exactly in sort of their ethnogenesis, in the way they emerge as an actually distinct people from the mass of at least multiple groups, many of which sort of didn't make it, were absorbed by the others, that were crushed, etc. And so the Rugi are referred to through a series of names that we find, of course, in the sources of the era. We have the term Rugii, or in English we can call them the Rugans as well, or the Rugians. In ancient Hellenic, it's the Rogoi, right? In Latin, the Rugi is the Latin name, the Roman one. And for this reason, they're mostly their size, the fact that, as we'll see now, we're not even entirely sure how they came about. For, unfortunately, in fact, most of the migration era peoples with an exact degree of precision were, among the other things, also a relatively obscure Germanic tribe during, especially late antiquity. They don't make it into the Middle Ages, if not as maybe a relic of their name for certain groups that weren't even Germanic anymore. This is actually an interesting part of the story. In any case, in their heyday, they had quite an interesting story and location, right? The Rugi made their mark with a brief kingdom, we could call it, which doesn't have to be given for granted, especially among those peoples that had essentially mostly dwelled into the Barbaricum, so never really exposing themselves more than much to the Mediterranean, and sort of the Romanization process that brought to the establishment of veritable kingdoms, starting from what we call at least the Visigoths in Illyricum. And this realm was established in the 5th century, still, however, along the Roman frontier, right? As many of these people, also the Longobards, that at this point were relatively still minor, right? Together in the same, more or less in the same region with the Airuli again. You could think of just one of these people sort of emerging rather than another. And of course, the establishment of a kingdom entailed a degree of territorialization, of political, let's say, spotting. So essentially, these peoples had entered the Roman radar, mostly the Constantinopolitan one at this point. And so, as federati or symmachoi were fundamentally settled, were allowed, or at least they would, the settlement, or at least they would, their prior settlement in these areas would be arranged or sanctioned with Roman authorities. Near the present-day town of Krems, under Donau, in Lower Austria. If you have never visited, I advise it to you, like, following the river. It's really beautiful experience. Also, if you are familiar with the, siege of 1683 siege of Vienna series, the various localities all around, and you know how important Krems historically was in that context. Now, historical records, I think it's interesting that you can sort of pinpoint certain locations, and also realizing that lots of other people sort of pass through the same places, such as the aforementioned Longobards, for example. This had historically been Pannonia, like quite a frontier area. So immediately what the Germans would encounter south of the Danube as the militarized Roman border, and at a short distance from the very Pannonian steppes. That of course connected the Rugi in this timeline for the first time, like the first mention, the first historical records of the Rugi together with their kingdom, following at least the death of Attila in 453, which naturally entails that the Rugi had fundamentally been settled there from a while, possibly joining the same Huns in their adventures, let's put it in this way. In fact, the Rugi, along with the Heruli, the Sciri, and other tribes, are believed to have migrated to this area where we find their kingdom from a remote ancestral land, not really much under the pressure from the Huns, as some scholars believe, but ultimately becoming part of Attila's Hunnic dominion, which occupied and settled the region. This is relevant because, as you know, these Germanic peoples, regardless again of the explicit formal confirmation of historical recordings saying that they had ethnogenetically, in fact, sprang out of Scandinavia, they really did come from Northern Europe, and regardless of the incredibly complicated ethnogenesis that we can't quite follow, unfortunately, through historical documentary, yes, they were largely Nordic. And if anything, they got lots of other elements along the way to stiffen their ranks, also through sort of hierarchical stratification within the system. But yes, they were dominantly Germanic, and it wouldn't make sense to think that, the Rugi, that as we'll see now, would emerge, in fact, from the same Scandinavia, would simply be sucked into Central Europe at basically almost in the eye of the storm of the Hunnic so-called empire, though it's too much of a big word, just because they were so eager to be there. More likely, they were already there, and they sort of met with this, which was not a bad thing to be, because essentially the closest you were to the Mediterranean, the more successful you were as a people to begin with, but they found themselves now invested by the Huns, which, however, doesn't mean that these peoples were simply passive to the enterprise. On the contrary, like the Huns were at most just hegemonizing basically this Germano-Iranic world against the Roman Empire and the barbarian peoples that had already settled into it as federati. In this clash, that of course witnesses the more civilized part as a winner, and with the Germans that are actually the only element in the system there that is capable fundamentally of integrating into a civilized reality, whereas the Huns as steppes peoples didn't go practically anywhere with that. We know that the Rugi, after Attila's death, joined a coalition that defeated the same Attila's sons, and the Ostrogoths that had been, in fact, the most important, the so-called Ostrogoths, the most important Germanic element within the Hunnic domination, quite appreciated for their for being essentially the most successful among the Germanic peoples that were at this point, like for the Ostrogoths, the Greutungi mostly are an Irano-Germanic people. At the famous battle, famous as mythological, like I want to think it really existed historically, but we know just that few. It's perfectly plausible politically and strategically, the one of Nedau in 454. There were still peoples, for example, the Longbirds, likely sticking actually to the last Hunnic rulers, right? So this was actually a clash also within the same Germanic groups. And given that the Huns were and their allies were defeated, the Rugi in this case, and those who had fought in the coalition, in their coalition, secured independence for this realm that they had established on the right bank of the Danube. Also across, of course, like they mostly controlled the length of it. But there is an important difference between what lays north and what lays south. However, in 469 there is a reverse, because the Rugi are now part of another coalition that was defeated by the Ostrogoths at the equally mysterious Battle of Bolia, which significantly weakened their realm. Right. I will not digress too much on the Ostrogoths because we have lots of stuff to cover about them, but you know the story. Made, in fact, already a chapter in 2 videos actually about the Ostrogoths for this series, and they were essentially the most success still, even after the destruction of their Pontic and their Pontic kingdom, and in fact the following of the Huns into Central Europe, and the defeat of the same Huns, like the single most powerful group, in part plausibly the most heterogeneous overall, because it had collected basically everything that had been swept by these movements from today's Ukraine to, in fact, to basically Croatia, Slovenia. And many Rugi at that point, given that the Ostrogoths were ever more pushed by the Byzantines as a robust conglomeration against Odoacer's Italy, allied with the latter, right? You know that also later, we'll see it now, like this Italic kingdom fundamentally controlled the also the Danubian watershed up to the same river, in fact, in the north, right? And so, of course, you have the Alps in between, and it's the centralized rule, but those guys laying north are fundamentally subject to Ravenna. And this is, in fact, what already happens with the Rugi. They're crushed by the Ostrogoths, and so, not knowing what to do, they subject themselves to Odoacer, because they become integrated into his kingdom. This is important because, as you know, Odoacer was not really at the head of a specific Germanic people, like, say, Theodoric, who would crush him with his Ostrogoths. Yes, again, these peoples were quite composite historically, but there is a marked difference between, say, I don't know, already the Visigoths in the west, the Franks, the Alemanni, that are a proper people, and essentially just the army of Italy that Odoacer controls, being constituted by various Germanic groups. You could say mostly war bands, but there were also like some sort of more communitarian elements there that, of course, were settled as colonists, also, you know, the relatives of these soldiers into Italy, right? But they weren't like an ethnically homogeneous thing. Like, there were lots of Germans mostly, but there were also other elements, Iranians, Turks, and in general, they weren't a single people. They weren't a single ethnos, a single tribe, a single confederacy. So that even the Rugi individually, again, were just an element of them. So Odoacer, suspicious of potential conspiracies against him from this group, invaded the same Rugian territory in 487. This is interesting because, as we just pointed out, the northern frontier was a bit shaky, especially considering the pressure that the Ostrogoths could exercise on these very peoples. I mean, yes, the Rugi had decided to, you know, not to side with those who had beaten them, which, as an option, like, as long as there was some autonomy to gain, still was understandable. But at large, it was evident, like, what kind of regional power was emerging from the east there. And so Odoacer decides to, you know, to avoid like some further Gothic penetration and or destabilization of this northeastern frontier of his, which is very interesting also for another reason, that the Rugian, the further Rugian debacle here, following Odoacer's invasion in Pannonia, allows the Longobards to migrate south into the Rugian lands. Right, the Longobards up to this point had been in Moravia. I made some videos in depth about probably the northern central European migration of the Longobards. We will also continue that for Pannonia proper. That was an important step. As I understand, the Rugi after these two blows did not feel particularly well. In any case, most of those remained in the Danube region, eventually allied with Theodoric the Great, that had at this point already killed Odoacer and established the Gothic-led government, at least in Italy. And the Rugi settled as a consequence, in part, in Pavia, right, and played a crucial role in this Italian kingdom until it was dismantled by Justinian. The thing about this in the connection with the Longobards is surely absorbed some of them to eventually later enter the same Italy in establishing their capital in Pavia. The second to last Rugian king, Eraric, who ruled briefly until his death in 541, was also elected king of the Ostrogoths. This is an important, albeit short-lived, achievement of the Rugians. This had happened due to Eraric's prominence among the same Rugians, but also the latter within the Ostrogothic, let's call it confederation at this point. Again, the Goths had a very, especially the Ostrogoths, among all Germanic peoples, had this greater sense of hierarchy and sort of also step-influenced sense of autocratic power that had been strongly reinforced also by the Roman monarchy that they were de facto holding. Although the Goths found the Rugi's boldness somewhat irksome, they accepted Eraric's leadership, which tells you how, in fact, much of a dynastic, this is also a very specifically Ostrogothic characteristic, like a sense of power they really had, right? Again, the Ostrogoths were the single most monarchic peoples among the Germans, and for the reasons we just explained. But they still recognized, in this sense, like leadership in traditionally in this, in the prowess of the chiefs and, of course, their capacity, especially to lead them to victory. Eraric convened a council to promote peace negotiations with the Byzantine Emperor Justinian, who held nominal suzerainty over the region. You know the story. Again, the Byzantines had basically allowed the Franks, the Goths, to have essentially a victory on, respectively, Gaul and Italy. So it was a way to control these, heartland of Romanity, just like the Visigoths in the same way in Spain, by proxy, right? So trying to maintain some control on the west that was in fact to be largely reconquered, especially in its Mediterranean dimension, as you know. And it's interesting that Eraric was into this kind of also appeasing policy with Justinian. In fact, the Ostrogoths, the story, they opposed these peace talks and instead elected Totila, the nephew of Ildibad, and shortly after Eraric was killed by followers of Totila after a reign of only 5 months, so it was not such a big deal, but still you could say that the Rugians at some point had a king of Italy, marking the gradual disappearance at that point of the Rugi from historical records. And so today we're going to look essentially at this story a bit more in depth. This was just a bit of an introduction, a brainstorm. Now, it's generally accepted that, as for most Germanic peoples, Tacitus first recorded the Rugi in the 1st century in his work De Origine et Situ Germanorum. The Roman senator, historian, and ethnographer described a group known as the Rugi, living near the southern coast of the Baltic Sea, located near the Lemovi and east of the Gutones, who were based near the mouth of the Vistula River. Right. So you immediately understand here, of course, if you're familiar, especially with the Germanic migrations, what the dynamic relays. These peoples were mostly crossing from Scandinavia into the, say, continental mainland of Europe, and especially like tending to follow like a southeastward direction, because especially at this point there were, Germany was already pretty crowded and brutal, and at least the Suebic Confederacy in the east is controlling most of this crossings, and sort of giving directions where the peoples could move. Right, the Vistula Valley in particular would allow the so-called sort of east branch of the Germanic peoples to descend towards up to, we were saying before, up to Dniester. This was the case of the Ostrogoths, all right? And this first attestation naturally is very important because we know also from other say, cross-referencing that, of course, Tacitus' source is very accurate in many ways, and that there was that very interesting distinction of groups that were sort of thrown into the meat grinder, and it had to be sort of tough enough in the tribal warfare to withstand blows and make their way through the continent. In the 6th century, so almost half a millennium later, the Byzantine historian and courtier Procopius classified the Rugi among the quote-unquote Gothic peoples, right? So this would mean essentially, again, the eastern branch of the Germanic peoples that, again, had basically risen under the protection of essentially a Gothic force, which is another way to say, again, the aforementioned East Germans, essentially whoever had laid east of the Suebic Confederacy that, as you know, was located along the Elbe, and that in fact began to take the more eastern direction also in their migration, right? Because otherwise there are different subdivisions in the Germanic people. Sometimes they are conventional, but I prefer the not just Eastern and Western, but also Elbe Germans. It would be like the central ones. In fact, the same Suebi, and so peoples like the same Longbirds, the Alemanni, that were instead there under those. So this was a different group, right? In fact, including the Goths, the Gepids, the Vandals, the Skiri, even the non-Germanic Alans that we made lots of videos on, that these were Iranians. And that, in any case, by that point in the 6th century, were associated in Constantinople this sort of Eastern European dimension, so to say. It's important to stress that some of these peoples had, as we'll see now, this is obvious for the Rugi, and for, if you know the foundation myth of the Longbirds, also for the Vandals, many peoples had migrated, had crossed into the actual island of Rugan, and then settled elsewhere, taking these different directions, right? Because they were technically that mobile, right? The fact that it took centuries for them to move has nothing to do with the actual speed that they could have used had there been an actual reason or capacity in a broader political, strategical sense to do so in the international arena, right? So things definitely speeded up in late antiquity. Now, a variety of historical documents reference places or groups with names similar to the Danubian Rugi, which obviously are very interesting for us because they can indicate possible connections with the actual people and their originary location. So primarily, we look at, first of all, like what does Rugi mean? Right. The etymology seems to be correlated with the grain rye. Right. In the 2nd century, Ptolemy recorded in Hellenic, naturally, the Ruti Kleioi, and a site known as Rugion along the southern Baltic coast, you know, this was a very important Hellenistic geographer. And by the 6th century, historian Jordanes, also with quite an information about the Germans from his background, identified the Rugi among the tribes that he believed inhabited Scandinavia. At least, like, those chunks that, as it would typically happen, normally remained in some places from, in fact, the original spring of the migration and or scattered along the way. Right, some of these peoples, like in the Heruli, for example, were crushed by the Longobards. Seemingly, they went back to Scandinavia. So, okay, we tried. Sorry, we're out. Go back home. This Rugi were located near the Dani, so that would be the Danes, and the Suetidi, the Swedes. He also mentioned the Rogas. This was instead an Eastern European community from the 4th century. We have just all this info, but quite scattered, quite separated from disconnected from one another. We have even, of course, medieval ethnonyms that suggest a possible connection with the ancient Rugi. For example, the medieval Rugi that we will see later were a tribe residing in Rogaland, that is in the southwest of Norway, near to the Bokna Fjord. And as we were already pointing out before, the modern coastal island of Rugan, today's northeastern Germany, is sometimes linked with the Rugi. Even though, again, the etymologies somehow conflict sometimes, because in that case, Rugan, Rogiland, etc., is connected with some spurs, like the famous White Cliffs of Rugan that also Friedrich immortalized in his famous paintings. But we know so few in general about this migration path or possible etymologies in this case that it's all like maybe even coincidental. Furthermore, the Rugi are connected to the Ulme Rugi mentioned by Jordanes, whose name likely translates to the island home, essentially, of the Rugi. Right. Jordanes describes these as a people who, centuries before his time, lived along the Baltic coast near the Vistula. Coinciding, of course, with the period he believed the Goths arrived by boat from Scandinavia as well, because there is this sense that it was a similar timing, the origins of these peoples. Naturally, Jordanes does strange things, and you have always to bear in mind that actually some of this information is made up, especially for this East Germanic branch, right? While we are very well informed about some peoples, like, I don't know, we know very well from Tiberius' campaign on the Elbe that, say, the Longobards already existed at the beginning of the 1st century AD. Like, we just have the name from the same Romans who were there fighting against them. Much of what happened in Eastern Europe was very much rewritten by the Byzantines during their, in fact, like from their sort of historical and geographical perspective, because they had to deal more with those in the East, and especially the Goths that had at some point even been understood as such an important people or group, at least diversified from the original one in the north, to even being opposed, like the Germans and the Goths, right, at this level. And so since they had, as we were pointing out before, to civilize them, to essentially co-opt them, to settle them, to control them, whatever, they also made up essentially a dynastic history for providing them with a monarchy that was more controllable. And there are big questions, let's put it in this way, regarding the veridicity of that story, also because these peoples, likely at the origin, didn't have any strongly pronounced monarchic orientation. Of course, they had leaders in the traditional sense that were to incarnate that superiority, etc., but they weren't as sort of centralized and hierarchical as like it would be, in fact, during the migration era, especially in this more Romanized peoples now that had been settled in the Balkans and further west. that would have, in fact, otherwise been more proud in the origin of their sort of collective individual liberty rather than else. They were always run by aristocrats, but they had a much more popular bias to them. And so, but the connection between Tacitus and Jordanus is interesting and sort of plausible. I will not digress today on the vexata question of, again, how much do we know about this actual connection with Scandinavia. I personally think there was. It's just you can't historically track them, right? It's complicated. You do know that many of these were Nordics. Everything points to that. Just we do not have the full explicit reference for us to understand, if anything, what these individual groups that are different from merely the ethnic background were born like and when exactly. But these other connections with Scandinavian toponyms suggest that there was more than something to it. But this is also an interesting question we can answer better in another video. There is also mention of a similar island that is on Rugii, which, as we've seen, is very similar to the aforementioned Rugi, appearing later in medieval Norwegian records in the Rogaland area. And so all this adds up to the idea that there would have been such, at least Scandinavian origin of the Rugi. This is important in a historical sense, as if they had been probably an identified, say an independent, like separate, identifiable group on their own in the time that they were migrating at least from Scandinavia, which sort of makes sense because at least we know that some peoples they'll change the name, such as the Vinneli for the Longobards, right? But in general, the migration entailed just an initiation, especially considering that Central Europe was actually much more brutally powerful and violent than Scandinavia at the time. So these peoples really needed to make a leap forward and change literally their own identity to get into the mid-grind. So this term Rugi, because of the aforementioned history, persisted beyond the 6th century. And it, interestingly enough, ended up referring to Slavic-speaking communities near the Danube and in Rugan. This makes sense because the Rugi had left there that historical mark. We shall talk also about this aspect because the different places were called at some point also with Slavic names. But the memory that these had once been Germanic places had gone as far as sometimes giving the name actually to some Slavic groups that occupied the place. The term Rugi was even used later in some Latin context to call the Kievan Rus, which is sort of fascinating. And as you know, there is a different etymology that we explain for in the videos about the Kievan Rus. But sometimes in medieval literature you find this sort of parallelisms. It's just like Byzantine archaisms, where you find that more modern peoples had the name of older ones occupying the same places because if those places were called like that by the Romans, they had to remain forever in the Byzantine mentality like that. Now, it's believed that the tribal name Rugi, as we were pointing out before, has origins tied to the term for cereal rye. It's an hypothesis, but still. So this would identify the Rugi as rye eaters or rye farmers. Rugits is the Proto-Germanic reconstructed term for rye. There are some variations. In West Germanic would be Rugi, in Old Norse, so in the North Germanic languages would be Ruger. We do not, however, see it among the East Germans, right? This could actually point at a more sort of Western connection. If these guys did come from Norway, they would not be particularly influential among the other East Germans that were, say, more closer to coming from places like Scania, like Sweden, today's Sweden, like the Longbirds, for example, etc. But and so they just preserved this term for themselves without actually being the majority of that linguistic branch among the Germans. We find other related terms to the Rugi, to this etymology of Rugi, in other Baltic areas, including non-Germanic ones. For example, Finnic would have Rugis. The Baltic and Slavic languages would have something like Rugi. Some scholars noted that this etymology narrows down the potential location for the Rugi's original homeland, right? Rye was not really a Scandinavian thing, right, during the Iron Age, which makes it possible that the later Rugi in Norway may not actually have originated from a pre-existing ethnonym connected with a Rugi, if we assume that that's the Rye is the etymology of their name. So just something coming later, which is part of the complications we have. But there are some other associations that are interesting. Before we notice, for example, the Ulme Rugi, right? So this island of the Rugi, a coastal area near the Vistula, noted by Jordanus. This term incorporates, as we've seen, like the concept of a Ruger tribe settled in this Holmer, just to Holm, like to follow the Old Norse, but it's just like in English, right? Holm. So this could again be the originary connection, at least, of the first settlement across the sea on the Baltic, which also makes you wonder why would they especially move from Norway to the Vistula, which is quite a distance, where normally like these peoples would follow shorter routes to begin with. In any case, that's the degree of uncertainty. Ptolemy's aforementioned Rutikleioi has been thought to be a possible error, right, in transcription for Rugi Kleioi, and it's not really clear how the Greeks got this name, but it may still objectively be a Germanic diminutive of some sort. Then you have other modifications of the term, for example, the Rugini tribe, that would have been the one connected with Rugan, but we've seen already what's the problem with the etymology of the land, that wouldn't connect it to Rye there. So some scholars, of course, pointed to the fact that Rugan would take the name from the Rugi, but the other historians connected also to the medieval Rani, the Ruyani tribe, and this is also relatively uncertain. In any case, the Rugini appear in historical records only once, in a list compiled by Bede the Venerable in his early 8th century work, the Historia Ecclesiastica Gentis Anglorum, of Germanic tribes that had not converted to Christianity. And so this would speak mostly from the Anglo-Saxon perspective about peoples in Scandinavia that they were especially in contact with, like across Northern Europe. Regardless, in fact, of this religious divide, that again is also much later thing, and makes you wonder like how connected it was to events that were happening very long time before. Jordanus, as we've seen, noted that a group identified as the Rugi still lived in Scandinavia by its times, near to the Danis, obviously, like close to at least the Jutland. Earlier theories suggested that the Rugi may have migrated from southwestern Norway to Pomerania in the 1st century AD because of simply the overlapping evidence again of the Norwegian area known as Rogaland or Rugii Fylke. So the land of the Rugi, and this transformation from Ruger to Roga can be explained by some natural evolution of language within Norse. However, again, still, what about the actual etymology? What about this distance from Norway to Pomerania? Right, it's possible. I wouldn't say rule out, but I would like to stress how we just don't know. It's not like you can find out. Like, I have sometimes people here making strange things by claiming to know their ancestors' names from the 5th century AD Scandinavia. I've studied my share of it. These people do not even exist, and you wonder how they. These ancient names do not even exist. What are these people doing? I don't think it's trolling. I think there is a wide amount of people that think that they can just track their ancestry to individual persons in places where we don't even know who was there really, on the basis of a DNA test. Like, what's wrong with your brains? In general, like, my advice is study history. Don't waste too much time with this. You're not really, if anything, if you're so obsessed about this ancestralism, just know that wherever you are, your ancestors living in 2,000 years ago would have been disgusted by whoever you are, and they would actually be right to begin with. So, yeah, you can sort of fantasticate about that. Just that know that there are obvious reasons. We all have shared Germanic ancestry. Particular in Europe and beyond. My same surname is Germanic. I have a pretty consistent branch of the family with pretty light features, but the question is not really it's that's enough to know certain things, right? And it's not even important to be so millimetrically exact about that. Excuse me, I drink a little bit. Now, scholarly theories about migration present thus several possibilities regarding the Rugi. They could have moved again from Norway to Pomerania. Some say that the opposite may have actually happened. It would have not been strange, really, that some groups that had, say, come from Sweden, let's say today's Sweden, would have, from certain Baltic coastal settlement, moved again back to Scandinavia. Absolutely plausible. Again, we know how certain Germanic survivors, let's say from the migration era, when beaten, mostly came back to Scandinavia, or elements properly that would move at some point if they didn't want to be subsumed by other peoples, even ones of Germanic ancestry. There was this shared understanding of the common origin from Scandinavia. That is very important, but it's also something that we can start tracing from the 6th century AD, when the Germans start finally writing about themselves, and they're also very much imbued with a lot of Roman historiographical, ethnography for them to be just aware really of what we're discussing. In fact, they do not really discuss these things in depth at all, which, of course, is somehow frustrating. It's possible that, of course, there were other places, such as the Danish islands, laying between these two regions, where maybe the Rugi were initially settled. There is also no archaeological way to find out things, because, of course, we have stuff from those places and times, but there are no tags, so we don't have the paleostudy of whichever group is full. Especially since, like in Scandinavia, there weren't this sort of bigger movements. Like mostly they started small from Scandinavia and then they made it big in Central Europe, if they made it big, also as a consequence of sort of taking over these other kins of their own. So regardless of the shared, say the broader shared ethnicity, like what is important again historically is the political bond, and we have normally an incredibly scarce amount of peoples that we can trace with certainty to the origins, like even existing as that name from the ancient times, because most other Germanic peoples were confederacies later on. And so it's not like the Franks or the Alemanni were originally peoples from Scandinavia politically. As you know, there were the groups of different tribes. We also know the individual names of from, say, Tacitus' times that eventually reforged themselves into this confederacy. What is fascinating about, however, the Rugi, the Airuli, the Longbirds, and others, is that this, being smaller originally, they sort of preserved a bit more of their, and living mostly in the Barbaricum, because some were real. Again, we understood how for example, the Goths augmented themselves. Right, these other smaller ones had relatively more conventional migration paths were also more likely to preserve their original onomastics as a whole people. We're making, again, the Longbirds are the best example ever in Germanistics, because they are truly the only ones we know that for sure, practically. And so that tells you how complicated it is also for the others. But there are reasons for that. It's conceivable even that one of these groups adopted the name of the other without any significant migration taking place, so that literally a place would call itself Land of the Rugi or something similar that sounded practically the same, and so that there is no actual connection with the people that we are discussing here. All right. So we don't have better information about the early cultivation of rye to be also too fixated with this etymology. Walter Pohl states that Jordanus is also not such an overwhelmingly reliable source. I've seen kids on the coming of my channel just once and then they disappear because they say, but Jordanus said that those people came from there. Like, yeah, okay, but Jordanus is writing with a very specific sort of set mindset, the same frame set of information that you can't quite just say, okay, he was actually saying something that historically happened for sure, right? In any case, all this issue may not be much of a problem. Consider that the Rugi may have been just a house. They may have not been exactly a people per se, but some sort of higher level of quality dynastic group that managed to connect through war bands, marriage, and settlement of their clients, of their subjects here and there, but having in fact a more scattered history, again, the more at least easily recognizable peoples that are also a bit of a puzzle, because again, if we had to look at what existed within the Ostrogoths, we would be really, really amazed. Tacitus tells us that the Rugi were near the ocean. They were close to the Gutones. So this would have been the Goths that are also mentioned by Ptolemy, that locates them east of the Vistula River. This is also mostly in fact what we know about the actual migration of the Goths. Of course, we're talking the Baltic Sea with the ocean, right? And so it would be today's Pomerania. Tacitus distinguishes these peoples, importantly enough, from other Germanic tribes. We're talking the Rugi, the Gutones, and the Lemovi specifically, noting that they used round shields and short swords and were ruled by kings. This is relevant because it could point to, here I don't pronounce myself on the equipment, that would actually seem to suggest that these individuals were sort of, these individual peoples were a bit weaker, actually, from a popular point of view, and they were stronger from a dynastic one, which is especially the case for the future gods. So there could be an actual connection of early dynastic bias for those peoples. And it could be even truer considering that the Eastern you went, the worse it was. And so like a bit like in later Eastern Europe, that basically autocracies would be stronger, and so not much sort of a bulky middle estate of some sort, differently from other peoples. For example, the Alp Germans were much more famous for their infantries, for example, very tough, whereas eventually the Goths, etc., became famous, especially when they took over the Iranians. They were in crisis in the Pontic steppe, like they became very famed horsemen, right? So you see little info here and there that can make sense overall in the picture and sort of connection across various centuries. However, when you look at Ptolemy, that writes in the mid-2nd century, you don't see the Rugi mentioned in the area. He talks about Rugan, that is, again, transliterated sometimes with either, okay, it's not so important without the O, for example. It's also Latinized sometimes as Rugium or Rugiam, the stripe referred to as the Ruticleioi, between the Vistula and the Oder rivers. And so mostly that's still the same thing. What is interesting about Jordanes Getica, by the way, is that the story goes that the Goths, arriving by boat from Scandinavia to a coastal area known as it would become known, evidently, that's also in part the same discrepancies of Jordanes himself, Gotis Kansa, displaced, so the Goths displaced there a group called the Ulmerugi. So this may have been, again, another people that had priorly arrived there, was beaten into, and this would explain in part also the relatively secondary international status of the Rugi, because frankly they weren't this powerful population that, as you see here, go on like the Goths, right? The Greutungi, the Tervingi, the other branch, and other peoples that mostly profit of their gradual weakening, right? We've seen it a bit for the Burgundians, for example. Burgundians were yet another people that got beaten a bit all around, and for this reason was resettled, relocated, and so on, and others were luckier and more capable. They managed to carve, even as originally smaller groups, some larger spaces. The Ox Earth culture is sometimes associated with both the Rugi and the Lemovi because mostly of the overlapping times and places with documentary evidence. Additionally, the archaeological Gustav group in western Pomerania is linked to the Rugi. Remnants of these people would have been found west of the Vidivari, along with other groups like the Goths, the Veneti, the Gepids, which are believed to correspond with the archaeological Debcin culture. So we're talking an interesting area where you have a Germano-Slavic mix. For example, the Vandals were something like that. So Germano-Celto-Slavic from the Rugi before. And so consider that also in the Slavic languages there are some words that in block there are common to all of them, which means that they were received, and there are essentially of Germanic origin, right? And these evidently were assimilated by the Slavs before their original migration, and so during the migration era at the latest. And so this would have also been due to the transit of peoples like the Rugi in their lands or nearby. What is fascinating is also the fact that the Rugi appear fundamentally just in Pannonia, that late in time, and so we don't even technically know where they moved, whether they went sort of a bit across or they followed some sort of more straightforward north, east to southwest direction. Again, it's not really clear because we don't have specific information, and that's basically, for me, the only thing we have is historiography at this point to understand who was who. Archaeology can't practically answer that in the absence of historiographical evidence. So we can imagine, as it's known, starting especially from the second half of the 2nd century AD, the Eastern Germanic peoples, primarily from what is now Poland, began to exert influence southward, pressuring neighboring groups and ultimately contributing to, for example, the Marcomannic Wars along the Roman-Danubian frontier. Some of them would just participate in war bands, right? And sometimes, like, suffering a defeat, they wouldn't show up again. This is the case of the Longobards, for example, in this instance, up to late antiquity. So it's difficult to simply pinpoint like single conglomerations in time and space, again, without any specific info. So considering the broader era, it's possible, however, that the Rugi were involved in that specific dimension. Archaeological findings from the Wilbark culture have provided new evidence supporting the possibility that, of course, there was a connection between such clashes, for example, with the empire in the 2nd century AD and the Baltic provenance of such of the Germanic fighters in part. So when Jordanus in his Getica talks about the Gothic king Ermanric, we're in the 4th century, of course, AD. He was one of the first rulers west of the Don River to confront the advancing Huns in Europe. And the story goes that the Goths at this point would essentially control everything stretching. So before they were overrun by the Huns, everything stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea. And that's where he also lists the Rogas among the tribes this king was ruling. Again, this is a bit, say, it's not fantasy like, but it's just like, what does it actually mean for a 4th century ruler to have this kind of territorial control? Like, because we don't have an actual evidence that this is how the system works. We can think of a general like capacity of attracting power, of having these subject peoples that recognize their inferiority compared to them. And even the term Rogas does not necessarily point to the Rugi. So you say historically we can be, I would bet on the fact that this is the actual narrative, that this is how it really was at the time, but we do not have any better foundation for it, and we can just want that, but not really, say, have that as an actual evidence. We have from the Laterculus Veronensis, dated around 314, one of the earliest distinct references to the Rugi's interactions with the Roman Empire. This work is an enumeration of Roman provinces and barbarian tribes from the era of the emperors Diocletian and Constantine I, listing the Rugi alongside the Aeruli. The source places them, however, in a section between the Scottish tribes and those north of the Lower Rhine, which, would speak, of course, of a much more Western context, which is even possible, especially if you think about the strange peoples like, the Attecotti, right, that we discussed also. It was full of Germanic pirates at that time. It was like another Viking era, right? There were Celts as well, Scots, Giles. And it's possible that if the Rugi had some sort of power base in the Baltic, or even in the North Sea, if we assume that Norwegian connection was true, why not, right? They would actually appear in such fashion. And the interesting aspect is that the Rugi are paired with the Eruli in this source, except sources from the 4th century do not actually speak of the Rugi much at all. The Eruli do figure instead. This is an interesting connection that could show us that the Rugi were still somehow less connected to a strictly Eastern European dimension, which is something that I suspect, given especially when they spawned magically into the Roman raider in the 5th century, and that in fact it wasn't also an overwhelmingly strong reason for especially smaller groups to move so fast across Europe. Another reason, again, why we think that their fall into the Hunnic orbit was accidental and not wanted. Just they had to accept it because they were there. It's not they could move at will. In fact, against also more powerful opponent. This is a bit the issue that you had as a Germanic tribe. Well, you know that the Huns were approaching, either trying to break through the Roman Empire and with force, just help you, the same Romans sheltering you eventually from the Huns, and vice versa, or sticking to the Huns and sort of participating to this more actively predatory and gambling game that was replete with sort of instability and predictability, but it could also open, in fact, some bolder options. We do know that the Rugi participated to Attila's campaign in Gaul. In fact, they are recognized as, in fact, one of the northern tribes of the Hunnic dominion participating in the Battle of the Catalonian Plains in 451. That, as you know, was a crushing defeat for the Huns and their allies or subjects at the hands of the Romano-Germanic forces. This is particularly important because yet another defeat. Don't think that this is so irrelevant, right? Because these peoples had very contained demographic resources to spend. Like even a single battle could crush them from terms of manpower, and would have easily made them prey of sort of more powerful populations. So we know of the Battle of Nedao in 454, in which basically you have the crumbling of Attila's son's dominion that was already falling apart by itself, and so these subjects give it a push. The Rugi are likely not like the determinant factor in this, but they participate, and they are also taking a stand, as we've seen, against the Ostrogoths that will soon come back, the next generation, to harass them and crush them, which is also, again, yet another proof that they weren't probably very healthy in forces at this point. And we do not really know anything about the Rugian kingdom before the Pannonian settlement. So also regarding their monarchic path, like we should first of all understand what kind of kingdom this really was. Of course, under the Huns there was a greater push towards autocracy, but this also largely depended on the nature of these peoples as well. For example, Roman influence was actually much more important. That's how, again, literally Alaric becomes a king and eventually is followed by all the great Germanic rulers. Peoples like, for example, the Longobards, who stuck the longest with the Huns, did develop like a more monarchic regime under these rulers that therefore could control them better, but they also remained markedly sort of like egalitarian in their internal social organization. For example, the Gepids weren't, and so that's not just a matter of the Huns or whatever. This has to do with sort of a broader historical cultural reason, right? And the Rugi, as far as concerned, like seemed to me a people that were probably had a very recent monarchy by this point. If we can't talk about the kingdom, we also must understand who was really in charge, and from which clans. There were multiple ones struggling for power, but as we've seen, it's especially the further subjection to the Ostrogoths that becomes unavoidable when this starts ruling from Italy, that confers this more monarchic direction. It will bring, in fact, a Rugian leader on the same throne of Ravenna. Following the events of the Battle of Nedao, we know that a faction of the Rugi settled near Constantinople, specifically in Byzia and Lüleburgaz, where they provided military support to the empire. This is very interesting because it shows that even if it was a fracture within the same Rugian people, basically, even when we say, I don't know, well, the Franks or the Visigoths were, I don't know, with the Romans, and say the Goths and the Gepids were with Attila, we actually don't see how there were plenty of war bands that were actually fighting from both sides at the same time. And there were groups, of course, of the main bulk of the people who were sponsoring this or that, depending on the political circumstance. So surely what happened at Nedao brought many sympathizers of a continuation of some sort of Hunnic regime to the fact that when it went downhill, and it's interesting that Constantinople would be seen as a safe haven for them at the same time, because at that point they would have lost power, and so it's not like there was a Byzantine continuation of Hunnic policy. If anything, yes, having Attila's empire crumbled, the Byzantines were all more eager to extend their sphere of influence on these former Hunnic subjects now without a leader. So of course there were Rugian auxiliaries in the Byzantine army that eventually settled down to become Romaioi. At that same time, however, the Byzantine influence was weakening also along the Danube. Not much because, in fact, there were many other players that were threatening the empire, but simply because of the general shrinking of, the demographic and agricultural resources. Plus, yes, these other peoples were settling in, and they weren't much of a threat. Say, I don't know, the Longobards or the Rugi or the Gepids couldn't simply, I don't know, invade and conquer the Byzantine Empire, right? They could create problems along the frontier, but at large they were controllable. We know that at this point of the Pannonian phase, many Rugi integrated into this independent kingdom led by Flaciteus in what was known as Rugiland, because now this was the land of the Rugi, so the aforementioned area corresponding to present-day Lower Austria. So basically the ancient Noricum, located south of the Danube, and but also across. After the death of Flaciteus, the Rugi of this newly established Rugiland, because they will call that wherever they moved, like as we've seen also in the Baltic and maybe even in the North Sea, were governed by another king, Pheletheus, known as Feva, and his wife Gisa. Simultaneously, another segment of the Rugi allied as Federati with Odoacer. You understand here how it was not a very big people, but you still have this detachments from it that do not really speak of a particularly solid monarchic apparatus, right? And this connection with Odoacer is important because it wasn't just about settling in a territory that belonged to Italy, north of the Alps, but because some Rugi would be stationed also into the peninsula proper when Odoacer was recognized as king by of Italy by the Constantinopolitan authority. By 482, the Rugi had adopted Arianism, which tells us something particularly, say, not excessively, but still interestingly clear about their international orientation. They were part of those peoples that fundamentally still believed, either by let's say convenience or legacy, that their position as mostly antagonists of the Catholic order was the right way to go. Right, most of this stemmed from some sort of actual lack of acceptation of the idea that somebody could be saved in the struggle in holy combat, which is interesting because you have this idea that I don't know, the Germans were maintaining, I don't know, the highest sense of Aryan sense of hero. No, quite the contrary. Like these fringe peoples in antiquity had the least Apollonian sort of mentality of the wall, and there wasn't really anything about, just like saying, I don't know, the Protestants would have not been good at warfare in the modern era because they did not think that works mattered. Obviously not, right? So this is not the point. But there is a striking connection between Arianism and Protestantism that I've been discovering in a strictly theological sense that, in fact, is against the empire as a whole. And in part because they lived at the fringes of it. And even of one that was broken now into pieces that alone could dominate the same Rugi individually. So, but there is a bigger reason. Normally, of course, like the fact that these were now Arian Christians rather than pagans, so-called pagans, is relevant because, if anything, they had just settled into a historically Celto-Roman land now, right? Like Pannonia. And so they had to have this charism of acceptability, but the local subjects that also stiffened their ranks in combat. This was, of course, necessary to connect yourself now to the broader, let's say, axis that was forming itself in Europe. As we've seen, the Rugi were not very friendly to the Ostrogoths, but at large there was a sense that the rising Franks and the Byzantines could constitute some sort of Catholic opposition to the survival of these more autonomous realities, especially the smaller peoples into Central Europe. So for one side you have the Gothic axis that would form itself in Italy and Spain that was sort of trying to resist the Byzantines and the Franks later on, that for this reason is a Arian axis that bonds with the Central European axis of barely Christianized but still Arian peoples that really side for that reason. In 1487, Odoacer decisively defeated Pheletheus Rugi. This is also what actually boosts, right, their literal deportation to Italy as soldiers, because many were captured and relocated in the peninsula. That after Majorianus' exploits suffered notoriously of manpower shortages, so we are in an era in which every body counts, so that we don't just slaughter people like before. We just want to actually settle them as colonists and eventually levying them as troops as well. This is the reason why Rugiland goes depopulated, and the Longobards that are just lurking in the shadows there and just reappearing after their defeats, like during the Marcomannic War, like settle into this territory from Moravia fundamentally. And so they occupy Pannonia gradually. And this is the typical age of Procopius and Jordanes, storytelling of the events. Again, we will, if you look at this series I made on the migration era peoples, you will naturally understand how all these stories are deeply intertwined, right? But we're also making other content regarding like sort of more in-depth specific histories like of the individual peoples that will further in fact expand on the topics and the interrelations. As we've seen, it had been the Goths at the Battle of Bolia that had pushed the Rugi to Rugiland, and now that Odoacer had passed from protector to carnifex almost, the Rugi side with Theodoric, the Ostrogothic king, exactly in 489. So they technically don't even wait for the demise of Odoacer that would occur in 493 by the hands of the same Theodoric. But they actually support his conquest of Italy against Odoacer, which meant that naturally when the Goths won the war, the Rugi were, however, now under their rule, right? And they couldn't handle themselves anymore like an independent people. The Goths again were more robust, were bigger, especially the Ostrogoths were possibly just the Longobards were the largest group of the migration era on the move, and in any case Italy gets both largest, like the Ostrogothic and the Longobard one. Also for obvious reasons, like it was the most appealing land of all for the many advantages that it would provide. And so, of course, like Theodoric wanted to concert that kind of axis we were talking about before across Europe and the Mediterranean, the reason for which he didn't go heavily handed against this people that was now broken. The Rugi retained their own leaders and refrained from intermarrying with the Goths, at least apparently. That would have happened anyway. But they sort of maintained their distinct ethnic identity. They just disappeared from historical records following Totila's defeat in the Gothic War. As we've seen, this guy had taken out Eraric, that was, probably the Rugian king now of the Goths. This is interesting because there were at other times in Germanic history kings of these minorities within the bigger majority of Germans that became kings, like, I don't know, Agilulf was Thuringian, for example, of origin. That's interesting. But again, it was a matter of elites mostly at that point. And the Gothic War basically cancels the same Ostrogoths from the face from the map nomenclature. At least many Goths remained in Italy, others had died, others were deported to the east, fighting for the empire, etc. In any case, between 535 and 553-54, most of what remained of the Rugi was indistinguishable. And later on, Italy was invaded by the Longobards that fully homogenized everything under that sort of ethnic, that is, so juridical identity on the longer run. So, you understand here the whole picture. We get the impression that together with the Burgundians, the Goths, the Gepids, some Rugi at a point departed from Pomerania, but also took a more westward direction, right? The Burgundians too made this bit of detour because they got defeated when they were probably in those Central Eastern European lands, and then went west, and they sort of settled on the Rhine because it was really the boundary there between the Huns and the Romans, hoping to survive, and it was, as you know, too delicate of a balance, and the bloodshed that followed at least provided us with the beautiful Nibelungenlied as a cultural legacy, but also the one of Burgundy that, as you know, was not say, Sepaudia, let's put it the kingdom of Burgundy, that we discuss it many videos. Not a radical contribution to the overall picture of especially the Germanic settlements in Western Europe, but still an important one that would mostly blend with the Franks, contributing also to their manpower and backbone. Surely during the migration era, we would find remnants of the Rugi scattered a bit everywhere across these territories. There would be a major chunk that would move, confident of that force, for which we see they can establish a kingdom, they can sort of participate more or less here and there, not with great success as we understand in this bigger powers clashes. But you could imagine many Rugians eventually remaining, eventually blending, with the Vistula Veneti, for example, with the Vidivari, other Germanic tribes that would later be mostly assimilated with fully fledged Slavic cultures to probably erase the strictly Rugian memory of the local identity. Jordanes describes, for example, the Vidivari in his Getica as a mixed group of tribes inhabiting the lower Vistula, still by the mid-6th century. This is fascinating because the Slavic migrations were about to happen pretty far and wide, and so we do know that some settlements there did endure, that even when distinguished themselves from the earlier Wildbark culture, that there was always some degrees of Scandinavian influence on the southern Baltic coastland, and we'll talk about these peoples that to a degree had also more piratical lifestyle and likely participated in fact also in raids into the Atlantic. There is one theory which, basing itself on the apparent presence of larger amounts of coins after essentially the mid-15th century in Scandinavia, links the phenomenon to lots of sort of Germanic groups coming back partly to the region after essentially the failure of this bigger enterprise dominated from the steppe, that would essentially bring together with part of these riches that had been looted from the empire, but mostly simply a resettlement for good outside of the Mediterranean, where lots of sort of more successful peoples, the ones especially siding with Rome, had made their fortune. There would be lots of connections between northern and southern Europe throughout the centuries of the migration era. It's always been a thing. People tend to sort of separate too much this connection, but really especially everything going from Scandinavia to Italy, and also the ancient Amber Road, Central Eastern Europe, the Baltic, Theodoric's Italy, etc. Were always very, very strong, and in general, even essentially the most powerful Romano-Germanic powers that were the ones in fact existing in the post-Roman world had a very sort of shared sense of their accomplishment, their sense of common Germanic ancestry that was now in the local laws, even in the local identities, even though, of course, the overwhelming majority of the population was Romance. The 9th century Old English poem Witzit, which compiles earlier oral traditions, as most of these works references the tribe of the Holm Rikum without specifying its location. This is similar to the Olmruge that we were talking about before, that our ancient sources basically point out, and that in this case derives from the Old Norse skaldic poem, the Akonarmal, and possibly in the Aralds Kveti. Further, of course, connections is possible. Rugians, we've seen beads, Rugini, were known at least in Anglo-Saxon Britain. Some of these may actually have been Anglo-Saxon ancestors because of course, like essentially Scandinavian origin of that people. So this, as you know, would have come from many different areas, the North Sea and the Baltic Sea coastlands, and so there's nothing to add in here. There was all a deep connection, right? Bede speaks of the Rugii as Germanic. Some other again believe it were maybe Slavic, but there is evidently some sort of connection overall with the ancient Rugi. Maybe at worst none of these names actually matches, but still we know that there were people who were Rugi at some point, lived there, and they went to Anglo-Saxon Britain to be part of the war. For the rest, one of the most interesting and important aspects of the war is how the Rugian ethnonym and toponym, aside from the overall failure of the people to preserve its independence, lived on. Even in areas that had been occupied by other Germanic rulers and eventually were Slavicized. In fact, this is the most interesting aspect. Walter Pohl, for example, shows us that some Slavs that had settled in the lower Austrian Danube, as cited in the Raffelstädter customs ordinance, where essentially the beginning of the 10th century, were called still like Rugians, right? And this again, there would have been different peoples here: the Longobards, the Bavarians, now essentially also the Magyars ruling over the Slavs that had settled there. So, but still, like the sense that there had been a Rugiland right there had survived. This is also possibly the case for the Baltic Sea. Reading Otto Freising's Chronicle 7-9, which is even more interesting, albeit here again it's possible that these toponyms had been developing autonomously in different ways. Otto Freising, as you know, is 12th century, and even the Kievan Rus. In fact, if you read the Continuatio Regionalis for the years 959-960, this is a famous work essentially from the 9th century, by Regino of Prum, that was the Benedictine abbot of the Imperial Abbey of Prum. There's this possibility that it's not overwhelmingly away from the times, right? The guy died in Trier, 915, but he had been born in Altrep, in the Rhineland, as early as 840, roughly. And so it's not very far away from, just a few centuries after, because the Rugi were an independent people, and who knows, like we may think that there was some connection, even with the Rus, but not because of the etymology. And in fact, this seems just more like a confused thing. Even though the Continuatio is naturally later, it arrives, I think, to 967. So we're in Ottonian times, which is also time in which the, in that sense, the empire was expanding to a bigger, in fact, ecumenic direction, and also the relation with the Rus would have been there. And in fact, we don't think there was really much of a connection between the Rugi and the Kievan Rus. It's just like some sort of coincidence, and it's likely like some just strange literary interpolation there. I mean, historiographical interpolation is put in this way, and there may not be in fact any intentional connection even with the Rugi there, but there is the possibility still that this name roamed around, that it had not been forgotten. It was some group in the Baltic, somewhere else, maybe during the migration era, moved with the Varangians or whatever, that maybe still brought that with them. Again, unrelated from the actual literary reference, but still possibly, right, in very very practical ways. So, what about this people? Well, it's naturally a different story from the ones we have seen more recently, but it's also an interesting one that it's worth telling, that surely has a lot to do with the complexity of the migration era, the vicissitudes of these peoples, the fact that more or less at large we have a lot to learn from the past, and that shouldn't be treated as like, oh my god, this is just the video that talks about them. Now we will hear the cool story. Yeah, it was cool. Of course, there were lots of imagine all the sagas, the sort of the broader cultural legacy that these peoples had, and that somehow vanished like that, or at least they were recorded by others, but to the point that the Rugi are not, in fact, so relevant to begin with among sort of the other groups in proportion, because the most important ones. They're of another scale of power, but you gotta admire how resilient at times they were, how they managed to handle themselves even after different defeats, but being unable, however, to avert the ultimate loss of independence and subsumption within other groups, right? But we will keep talking about these groups. For example, the Airoli are very interesting. I think these can be next, but we'll have also to talk about Slavic peoples, those who didn't sort of make it either because they were conquered by somebody else, including the same Slavs, other Slavic groups, and that at some point we will go a bit more in depth. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.